This session is called In Conversation With, and it will be facilitated by Patrice Dutil. So I would like to introduce Patrice. He is the Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University. Before joining in August 2006, he was the Acting Executive Director and Director of Research at the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. His research interests are political and public sector leadership, e-government, regulatory policy and governance, and the policy development process. He's also the acclaimed author of The Politics of Liberal Progressivism in Laurier's Quebec. He recently also published and edited a collection at the University of Toronto Press on public sector leadership entitled Searching for Leadership, Secretaries to Cabinet in Canada. And next year, his new book on the Ontario Ministry of Finance will be published, again at the University of Toronto Press. I will turn things over to Patrice, and he will introduce his other guests.
I'd like to introduce Bob Fowler. He's currently the head of the Public Service of Nova Scotia, the Deputy Minister to the Premier, and the Clerk and Secretary to the Executive Council. And he's also the Deputy Minister of Communications?
Absolutely.
Wow. That's interesting. This is a new development, we should write about this. Okay. He's been a Deputy Minister since, head of the Public Service. He's been in this job since September of 2006, so 3 years into the job. In February 2007, the position of Clerk and Secretary of the Executive Council was added to his portfolio. He was also the Deputy Minister of Treasury until December of 2008. I mean, you've had a combination, an overlap of functions that is really quite remarkable.
Or foolish.
Very foolish, yes.
Yes.
Well, if you're serving your Premier well, I guess it's not so foolish. He's been in the public service for 34 years, most of it in the Nova Scotia Civil Service. Before his recent appointments, he was actually he was Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs for 2 years, and he also served for a time as Deputy Minister of Immigration and Deputy Minister of the Department of Health Promotion and Protection. Before he got these jobs, though, he was in the middle of a 3-year executive interchange with the Federal Public Service as Regional Director General of Health Canada Atlantic Region, responsible for the program delivery and Pan-Atlantic liaison for the 4 Atlantic provinces. So we're going to talk about the flu, inevitably, this morning. It's also my privilege to introduce Tony Dean. For many of you, Tony does not need much of an introduction. He's also had tremendous experience in public administration and public policy. He was a senior advisor for 3 provincial premiers in different political administrations, served as Secretary to Cabinet and head of the Ontario Public Service and Deputy to the Premier from 2002 to 2008. He's currently an advisor to the London-based Commonwealth Secretariat and the Commonwealth governments, and he's currently providing strategic and capacity-building advice to the Prime Minister of Kenya. Previous international experience in leadership, governance, and capacity building for policy and delivery includes Vietnam, the UK, Belize, Grenada, St. Lucia, and also as an advisor to the IMF on organizational development. Tony's been out of the job now for 2 years. Yeah. You can see he's extremely busy and continues to represent Ontario very well. He's a recipient of the Order of Ontario. Now, this is a conversation, and I'll give you full disclosure. We are as unscripted as we can, but being good civil servants, and me a former civil servant, of course we had a conversation before. So it is unscripted, but we did talk about the best approach to this kind of topic. It was a half-hour conversation last week. We sort of went around the topic, thought about a few themes, and we're going to share that with you this morning. This is a conversation, so I'll be asking some questions, but I want you to ask questions also. So there's 2 ways of doing this. We're going to talk for 40, 45 minutes, depending on whether they really get angry with me or not. It could be shorter, it could be longer. If you want to write notes down, write questions down, you can pass them on to me. Or if you want to stand at the mic, we'll have some 15, 20 minutes at the end to ask questions. It's a rare opportunity, again, to ask questions of these 2 gentlemen and get a sense of their sense of leadership in the particular context of the public service, which is fundamentally different from the private sector with challenges and opportunities of its own. So I'm going to step into my position as a host of the conversation and start with my question. My first question. Now, the theme of this conference is the A-Team. And the first thing that came up last week was, is it really possible to have an A-Team in government? Can you really say, here's my A-Team, who is the A-Team, what does it look like? Do you have any general impressions, Bob, about that?
Well, I guess I'd start by saying absolutely you can have an A-Team, and I would argue any municipal, provincial, or federal organization has all kinds of A-Teams. I think one of the phenomena of public sector, I guess one of the reasons IPAC is what it is, and we hope it can, is that we don't talk enough about what does go on within government. I think that there's a difference between private sector and public sector in terms of our daily lives as Canadians, is it is on the front page of the paper every day. So whether it's Auditor General's reports or various other, the functioning of Parliament or various legislatures, what happens within the public service in terms of the service to Canadians, service to the people of your respective province, is there every day. So I think there are all kinds of A-teams, but I think you truly, as senior leaders, the major responsibility is how you nurture those A-teams or empower the system to, in fact, strive to be an A-team. The difference between, I'd say, private sector or business is a profit motive. I would argue in public service, it's a service motive.
Tony, is there such a thing as an A-Team in private and public sector?
Well, there is. I agree with Robert, and I think you find them in different public sector organisations, and you find them at different levels in the organisation. You certainly want the Deputy Minister's team to be an A-team, but in the Ontario context, I think our provincial interministerial councils are very, very effective A-teams, as are their federal regional council counterparts. You know, what makes them A-teams? I mean, we may go on to talk about this, but they're empowered, they manage risk well, they're collaborative, they're inclusive, and they get the job done. And you know, it's when you think about A-teams in government, I think you sort of think about what they accomplish, but you also have to look very carefully at how they do it and what they do and what makes them an A-team aside from results. I can tell you I would take any public sector A-team, and you know, given my strange accent, I actually have a problem pronouncing that letter, and put
very
it,
Canadian,
and put it up against any A-team from any other sector, and have absolute confidence that we would do remarkably well. So we have A-teams, and they're high-performing A-teams.
Let's turn to your backgrounds. Both of you have been parts of A-teams. Let's assume that there is the existence of A-teams. You've both been parts of A-teams. Was there something in your experience when you were not secretaries to cabinet, the position, the high-level position you were in? What was your experience as being part of an A-team that shaped your view of leadership and that you sort of retained from your experience as you exercised your influence as Secretary to Cabinet? Was there something in your past?
I guess I would say that I had people in the public service. I've been in it for 34 years, 9 departments. I think somebody said the other day they'd counted all the jobs I have, and it was 23 different job titles. But I also had assignments, and it was people who believed they saw something in me or were prepared to risk in me to say, can he lead? Can he manage and can he lead? And there's obviously a difference between your ability to manage and your ability to lead. So I would argue that in my early formative part of my public service career, before I had committed to public service, which I think is important, is that I was given opportunities. And I'll be the first to admit that I skinned my knees a few times, and it was much like my mother when I was a little fellow and fell off the bicycle. Somebody put a Band-Aid on and said, now learn your lesson and go forth and do good. Same thing happened in government. People, you know, the ability to risk and the ability to have people to see beyond the mistake you made, which might get magnified, and be able to say, I think there's some qualities in this person.
Was there a particular experience that shaped your attitude towards leadership? Were you tested under fire?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you give us an example of how this?
Yeah, I was thrown in the deep end when back in my early career. I was what was called a residential tenancy officer, And our director of rent review, back in the Trudeau days, I'm dating myself, late 70s, and was thrown in to be the director of rent review in an extremely adversarial situation in our newspapers and everything else about rent review and rent control and what it meant to the future of the province and destroying the housing industry. And I learned very quickly, I think, the key lesson, which was I may have been the front person, but it was the development of the people around me, the support I got from mentors, the support I got from senior leadership to be out there and get that. And that crystallized to me.
It's interesting because you were at a local level there, and yet you were experiencing the opportunity of being an A-team on that file. You were the A-team. You were part of that A-team.
I was the presence of the A-team, but what I think I learned was that it's not I, it's we.
It's we.
And the we is what makes leaders successful.
It's the team. Tony, similar experience? What shaped your view of leadership as a member of an A-team?
The early days in government for me, when I was lucky enough to land at the Ministry of Labour, which is an absolutely terrific ministry. It was 20-odd years ago, it is today, and part of that is its culture. I think it flows from the work that it does, from the nature of thinking about and working with issues of worker health and safety and employment standards for people who need government's help the most. So a sense of collaborative culture, of caring culture, a sense of service, and that we're all in this together was something that shaped me very significantly. Robert's point about people giving you space to grow and opportunities is absolutely huge. I think, though, that I was, like Robert, obviously fortunate to work for some really terrific leaders. Leaders who knew when it was important to be tough and to send a message and to give you some hard feedback on your performance, but also gave you space to grow and remembered to give you a solid pat on the back when you've done something well.
Was there a particular event that sort of gave you the impression that you could be a leader, not just inside the ministry or on that file, but a leader of the Ontario Public Service? Was there a particular experience that shaped you in that way?
I never imagined, first of all, that I would become the leader of the public service. The big, as it is for many professionals who come up through the policy stream, the big break point for me was moving into a supervisory job for the first time, where I had to leave this policy world partly, behind and start to think about managing people. And one of the things that I noticed at that time was that a lot of people want to hang on to their old job. And as we make this transition from professional to supervisor or manager or leader, a common challenge that people have is they still want to be the lead professional. They still want to be the go-to person. They want to be the expert. And I have limited capacity. And in some respects, I think it served me well, because I determined fairly quickly I couldn't continue to be the policy manager and expert and be a manager and leader of people. So I made a conscious effort to try to develop my skills on the people side and to leave chunks of my job behind. When you do that, and that's kind of risky in a way, but when you do that, you see people come in to fill the space that you've created. Absolutely. And you see them learn and grow in the way that Robert and I were given those opportunities. And you occupy new space. And it's occupying that space is good for the organisation and it's good for you professionally. So that was a really crucial point in my development, actually, Patrice. And I mean, I just want to give you one other example. You asked about, a moment where you saw leadership in action and you're almost branded by it. I was in a sort of senior policy job on a change of government. and there was a new deputy minister who was known to me quite well from past work. And he had his first meeting with the new minister, new government. And without, without a great deal of sensitivity, I think the message he heard was, what's Dean still doing here? Our sense is that, he may have been a bit too close to the previous administration. And he met with me in a little bit worried and said, there's a bit of concern about you, and you might be advised to kind of lie low for a while, he said. And this was an instantaneous thing. I looked back at him and said, you know what, I cannot do the job this way. I cannot lay low for a while. I'll do the job that I've been doing for this administration as well as I did it for the last one, and if that doesn't work out, then so be it. I'll be happy to leave on those terms. And this was the moment. He looked back at me and just as quickly said, okay, if that's the way you can do it, if that's the way you have to do it, I'll support you as much as I can. And that moment for me, that moment of leadership, that was really taking the risk. That was going out there, him making an assessment. How comfortable do I feel about where Dean's going on this one? And saying, fine, run with it and we'll see how it goes. That person was a mentor and coach to me in that moment, and in my mind and in what I do and my approach to the job was for the rest of my time in the OPS. It was a really critical moment.
It's interesting.
Yes, please, Bob. Please. Obviously, we've just been through a government change in Nova Scotia from a minority Conservative government. And by the way, for any students of government or provincial and federal politics, minority government is a good thing once in a while. A steady diet. So obviously to a majority NDP government, and the supreme compliment would be that they asked me to stay on. The Premier asked me to stay on. I fully expected that I'd be in the consulting world or doing something different, but they did ask me to stay on. So obviously a compliment. But interestingly, the same week that the election happened, and I had the conversation with the Premier, I spoke to what we call Success for Managers, which is a program for our managers, whatever ilk, that maybe people have been in the system for a long while and really want to improve their skills, or we're encouraging them to. But this particular gentleman, who I've known for 25 years professionally, decided late in his career to step up to a management job. And after my presentation and the Q&A and the coffee break afterwards, I stayed around. He came over to me and he said, I just want you to know that after 25 years, you're still Bob. And actually, in a funny way, that was actually a greater compliment, or as great a compliment, in terms of saying that leadership or responsibility didn't change who I was. So I think that's an important thing to remember. Remember who you are.
You've both brought out the fact that A-teams exist everywhere in government, that there's not just one A-team, and you've both given examples of where you were leaders of A-teams at a certain level and where you cultivated a certain sense of loyalty and performance that stayed with you and with your teams. You felt confident, Tony, in being able to stand your ground because you knew you'd have the support of your team, presumably. Let me test you now. As secretaries to cabinet, you're facing another A-team across the board, and that's your political A-team, your premier, his ministers. How do you deal with that A-team? Bob. And again, I have to emphasize, Bob is going through a very interesting experience, going from a minority Conservative government to a majority NDP government, the first one in the history of Nova Scotia.
Well, let me start by saying I didn't realize until the majority government was in place, cabinet sworn in, had 2 or 3 cabinet meetings, I didn't realize how different my job was for the 3 years in minority government. Because it is a job of compromise, and I didn't realize how much of what you see in the legislature of your House of Assembly about political compromise and all those things, I didn't realize how much that permeated my job in terms of what I did. And so it's amazing. Actually, it's quite refreshing to have a majority government. So I think that's
feel a little freer with the majority?
Absolutely. But I have to say that the support for the public service existed in both governments, but some of the things you might wanted to put through in terms of legislation or change is much more difficult, because no matter what the initiative is, it always has a political overtone in a minority house, especially a very slim majority house, a minority house. So that made a huge difference.
Tony, what about you?
Well, just like any other group or organisation, there are A teams and there are A teams, and there's a fairly wide variation on what you'll find in political offices, and it varies from ministry to ministry. It varies from Premier's office to Premier's office, and just like any other team, it depends on the message and the tone that's sent from the top. If you have a minister or a premier who says, listen, we're engaged in a partnership with the public service, and I want us to manage ourselves and our relationships as though it is a partnership and we will thrive together, you are in pretty good shape. I mean, that and picking the right people for the critical jobs. In the same administration, you can have another minister who, for whatever reason, in some cases perhaps legitimate reasons, has some suspicion, has some concerns, feels a bit let down, and in that sense, the public service has a bit of a hill to climb. But it is not an unwinnable climb, and where you have a bit of a resistant or perhaps mistrustful political office, you have to work to earn that trust, and partly you do that by just doing everything really well. You do it by putting the people who are interfacing with the political office, you make sure that you are putting the very best people in key jobs where that interface occurs.
It's not just you.
It's right,
Absolutely.
and you provide support and advice to people in that political office who may well be new, who may well be untested, and in fact are kind of desperate for some advice. So the public service in that sense has a bit of a capacity building job to do, and you find this with new administrations, right, Bob?
First public statement Premier Dexter said actually during the campaign, but the week he was elected was, we will have a partnership with the public service. And
I distinctly remember, Tony, when you came in, when the Liberal government came in, there was a letter that was issued by the Premier to the public service. And dare I say, I definitely recognize the Tony Dean style to that letter. It was a very nice letter. It was a very nice letter about partnership with the public service and about this willingness to work with that A team and the teams that support the A team. I thought it was very interesting.
I will say that there are many public servants in Ontario who still have that letter on their wall or on their desk. And the very first thing that the Premier-elect said to me, still sitting in the office of the Leader of the Opposition, was, listen, Tony, I consider myself to be a public servant too. So we're going to be working together. So,
first thing I said to the transition team for the new government was, you have a choice. You can trust the public service and bring them on your side, or you can go the other route and your transition will be slower. That's 30 years of advice. And there's just no question in my mind that putting your trust in. But, A teams don't have equal members or the same members. As I like to say, they all put their pants and their skirts on the same way as we do. But there's strengths, just as there is in your deputies team or any teams any of you work on, there's different strengths there. There's, in our case with our new cabinet, we have 3 ministers who are brand new MLAs as well. So are they not only learning to be a minister, they have to figure out how to be an MLA and what that means, and those types. They've never experienced a question period, that type of thing, and so they depend a lot. The other key about the A team, the political A team, is the choice the political A team makes about their political staff and what they understand about the professional bureaucracy. I find ministers come to that a lot quicker, quite often, than political staff do.
That's an interesting challenge, the political staff A team. I think we're going to walk onto really thin ice at that point, so let's move on. We were discussing last week, what does an A team stand for? And we got a little bit alphabetical. A is for action. And in the public service, very often you have to spontaneously call upon an A team to respond to a crisis, an action team. So the A team in this case becomes an action team. Bob, can you give us an example or talk about an instance where you had to call upon or had to be a member of a team that had to react quickly to some sort of a crisis, emergency, that kind of thing, an action A team?
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back to my time with Health Canada as the Regional Director General and do that for a reason. One of my interests in public service, and maybe one of the things I'll pursue after public service, is what is it about a crisis that brings the best out in people, and I'll say public service? Why is it that we tend to manage crisis so well, right, as opposed to sometimes the day-to-day? The example I'll use is, and actually Tony will be part of this story to a degree, was during the SARS crisis. I was with Health Canada. Obviously, Health Canada in Ottawa, this is before the Public Health Agency, was fully consumed with SARS in Ontario, and rightly so. At the same time, there was a lot of going on in the world about terrorism and so on. And I was 2 months into the job as the Regional Director General, didn't even really know who my team was, let alone who the A team was, other than by position. I was at a little staff retreat just outside of Halifax, and I got this phone call from this gentleman. I didn't have a clue, other than he said he was a superintendent from the RCMP, and I said, oh, what have my kids done now? No. And he said, you need to be in at H headquarters in 15 minutes. And I said, well, I'm an hour away, but I'll come. And what it was is they had a ship offshore coming that was actually going to Quebec, diverted to Halifax with a sailor who had died supposedly from anthrax. And so they had determined that there was no imminent terrorism threat. This is the military, the RCMP, CSIS, everybody. But once they determined that, they said, oh, it's a health issue. Well, Nova Scotia Health, remember I'm with the federal government at this point, even though I'm a provincial public servant, says, can't dock that ship. Might have anthrax, don't want it on shore. So I was thrust into the middle of this, so I called Ottawa. And talked with the deputy minister, associate deputy, then the deputy, and they said, look, we have no capacity to lead this. They said, it's yours. They said, we'll give you some medical help, it's yours. So I very quickly had to mobilize the team, not only within Health Canada regionally, with the help of the provincial medical health people, the federal family, to talk about it. And for 5 days, we were 24/7 with the ship quarantined off shore with a permit around it, manned by the Coast Guard. We were doing investigative histories through CSIS of where this person came from and what their background was. In the end, it wasn't anthrax, just the good news part of the story. The fascinating part for me was, and I don't know where I learned this, but I realized in managing a team that was really 3 or 4 layers of teams, was my job, other than being the person that got stuck with dealing with the media, was that I had to keep bringing people back to what was important. Keep reminding people what we were doing, not to get off in the rabbit tracks, not to let a pursuit of 100% of the solution get in the way of 90% action. And it was interesting for me because what I learned, and it stayed with me ever since, and this is only 7 or 8 years ago, was how critical it is to look at why we perform so well in crisis, why people can put up, whether it's a matter of the adrenaline rush and it brings out the best in everybody. But I'll tell you this, 2 of the federal public servants who were on that A team, who I just got to know, are both now in senior jobs in the Nova Scotia Public Service.
Good. So in this case, the Action A team, your challenge was to keep them focused. An Action A team.
I'd go back to the same year, 2003. Before I do that, though, I think this point about why we do well in crises is really, really important. And having observed a few and been involved in leading the response to a few of them, it seems to me that in crises, our accountability is never clearer. The normal restraints on our behaviour and how we do things are never further away. We are simply told there is a crisis, fix it, get it done, and the subtext is, I actually don't really care how you get it done, fix it. And public servants love that challenge. I mean, they may not like the nature of the crisis, but they respond wonderfully because their raw talent and experience is just deployed. And they get out there and they get the right resources and they get the right people and they get the right plan in place and they have somebody to help them keep focused. And they get that job done. And that is so different from the rest of everyday life, right? Where, in fact, it seems that, and I spend a lot of time with federal colleagues these days, it seems that there are layer upon layer upon layer of restrictions and rules and worries about risk. So all the blocks are pulled away, and the public service is unleashed, and they get fantastic things done. So back to 2003, we'd been through SARS 1 and 2, and we were taking a bit of a break and saying, well, that wasn't so bad. That was kind of weird, but we seem to have got through it. When a few weeks later, I'm sitting in my office and it's a quiet day, and I'm kind of enjoying the solitude and peace.
There's no such thing as a quiet day.
And
Relative speaking.
And suddenly, you know, the noise is different in my office, and I realize the lights have gone off and my computer screen it goes blank. And I think, oh, my assistant, you know, Sue Stafford, has gone and plugged that kettle in again, and the fuse has blown. Not understanding at this point that the entire northeastern seaboard continentally had lost power. There was no playbook, right? There was no. I didn't go to what to do in the event of a continental power outage manual in the bottom right-hand drawer of my desk. Interestingly enough, and I think quite luckily when I think back, we'd been through SARS. I knew where the Emergency Operations Centre was in government. I'd spent many days and nights there. I knew that it had emergency generating capacity, as one would hope in an emergency operations centre. So I marshalled my immediate kind of staff, and we wandered over there and kind of set up a base of operations. I think a couple of things. One that was important for me at that point is the process and the protocols. Just knowing where to go and what to do in the first instant. Because in these situations, people can be running around in all kinds of directions, and you can be on phones, and it can actually be very messy. So, second thing is assembling the right people for your crisis A team. And we assembled in a very short period of time 2 or 3 layers of personnel over at the operations centre. The first was our own ministries, and it was kind of remarkable, as it always is, how many ministries had a role in this, not just community safety, but health, because one of the first things we discovered was that the hospitals down on University Avenue only had 15 to 18 hours of diesel fuel in the tanks running the generators which were now operating power in those hospitals. And how to get more diesel fuel when we discovered that in the early hours diesel fuel trucks are left empty to discourage theft, but you actually need electrical power to run the pumps to get diesel fuel into the trucks. Stuff like that that you would never have imagined. So municipal affairs, health, community safety, transportation, economic development, on the phones talking to the auto companies about rationing of available power. And then the experts from the sectors, from the independent electricity operator, from Ontario Power Generation, from Hydro One, the distributor, who in fact had an emergency plan to restart power. And then thirdly, the right political people. The Premier, his key staff, the staff from on the political side from energy and from environment and from economic development, housed separately with their own quarters and their own communications equipment on site. So we had the best of the resources of the provincial government on the staff side. We had the technical expertise who were managing the restart of the system, actually operating from the control centre, and we had the right political people on site to make decisions and to help with communications. The thing that struck me most about that, I mean, was when you've got the right people, however diverse they may be, all in the same location, information is shared very quickly, decisions get made, and the risk communications, getting the message out to the media and to the public, is much, much easier. And in those early days, think about this, it's the back end of a mandate. There's an election coming in about 2 or 3 months later. The Premier of the day has already gone through SARS. Now all the bloody lights have gone out. And he wants to know one thing. When are those lights going to be back on, Tony? Give me the time when everybody's going to be able to flick the switch. Of course, those answers aren't available quickly, which is why you need the technical expertise in the room. And so the ability, our ability to move from the status of the power system to its impact on the economy, to the operation of critical health and safety facilities, and to get messages cleared through the political office and out to the public was really, really fast. It was for me a terrific example. Partly, I will say this, partly without SARS, I don't know how long it would have taken us to get over to that operations centre. So there was a good deal of in a sense, good fortune involved because we knew where to go. But beyond that, getting the right people on the team and empowering them and getting everybody talking and communicating was very important. I mean, the last thing I'll say is that we at that point had a brand new, and I think acting, senior leader of emergency management in Ontario. And at our first big table meeting, I remember him saying, just as before we went into it, he said, you're the cabinet secretary, I'm new here, you've been through SARS, you've been doing all this. It's probably best if you chair this. And I thought about it for a minute or two. And then I thought, you're the acting leader of emergency management. You've been around here for a while. You just, you didn't come in from another sector. I said, no, this is your job. I'm part of the team. It worked beautifully. He stepped into the role. His staff were expecting him to be in that role. It would have been actually I was a heartbeat away from saying, what the hell, I'm worried about it, Premier's worried and all the rest of it. But it was a terrific experience. Lights came back on. My entire house got flooded because we filled a bathtub full of water, worried about the water facilities going down through lack of power, and went to sleep with the taps on, and so we had an all-house flood as a result of that. But otherwise everything was well. So the lights did come back on.
They did. So in terms of an action team, then you had, in a way, latent leadership waiting to be triggered into action, but you also had taken steps to make sure that there was an A-team ready in case there was an emergency.
And Patrice, I think the important thing in both examples, and Tony hit on it, there are conditions in an emergency where some of the rules get forgiven and so on. But beyond that, I truly do believe there are lessons for people to study emergency situations, see how A teams got selected, how you were able to cross jurisdictional boundaries, not because you were breaking any rules, but because you looked at the problem and you knew what had to be done, and you sort of said, it's got to be done now, and who's going to do it? So I think there's a lesson in that in terms of leadership that are good case studies for people.
Let's talk about another kind of A, and this is what I would call the anticipatory A team. And by that I mean the policy work. Aside from the drama of dealing with an emergency, you also have A teams that worry about the future, that anticipate events, and that are working on policy issues that are likely to emerge in the future. And that's a big part of your leadership as Secretaries to Cabinet, is making sure that the policy machinery functions to make sure that events or phenomena in the future are adequately dealt with and managed by the state. Can you give me an example of a policy A team of anticipation that you either triggered or encouraged as part of your leadership as Secretary to Cabinet, Bob?
Yeah, I'll give it at two levels too. First, let me say that when I first remembered hearing about the fact the deputy ministers met, now this would go back 15, 20 years ago. I can remember a very learned deputy saying, well, it's deputy school. We go and the center tells us what's going on. And I can remember thinking at the time, and certainly as I got to the deputies' tables, then that's not good enough, you know, that there is a role for deputies. I describe it probably oversimplified, that if the elected cabinet or the cabinet of the day is the board of directors, then the deputies' table should be the board of management. And when I say that, what I'm saying is that my philosophy with the deputies' table that I brought and actually encouraged from my predecessor is it's one for all and all for one. And when I say that, if we're doing a major public policy initiative, we own it at the deputies' table. We don't all lead it. We do assign leadership for that, but then the table supports whoever those leaders are, whether it's team leadership or individual leadership. And I guess the example I'd use would be that for years and years in Nova Scotia, and don't ask me why this happened, we were not able to write what I'll call a social prosperity framework, a piece that sort of looked at what is our fundamental understanding of what social prosperity means, what's its relationship with economic, and so on and so forth. We were very good at getting together and talking about it, and then we'd go to ground and talk about individual social problems, you know, low-income housing, poverty, you know, not that those are insignificant, but we'd sort of go to ground on issues every time. And so at the deputies' table, I challenged the deputies' table, and we workshopped this ourselves. How are we going to be able to mobilize the system to, in fact, write our first version of this? And we did, and we assigned it to our deputy of community services and our deputy of education. There were, I think, 8 deputies that sat on the steering committee, and we had, every second week, we had an update at deputies. The important part was they mobilized around the fact that the deputies have set this out for a challenge, so the system mobilized around that. Those 2 deputies led it but do not own it. We owned it at the table. So I think the notion of being anticipatory, we needed to get something done because that allows us then to nest other things under. It allows us to look and say, how does that fit the bigger picture for the province? And by the way, how do we adjust that now that we've just gone through an administration change? So instead of, I believe, in that case, us being reactionary and reacting to the new government's mandate, which is different, but in many ways the same, okay? We're able to use that framework to adapt to that. And then what that does is allows us to penetrate in the system quicker. So that would be my
Tony, what about you?
Very quick one. It's an inside the ballpark example. Ontario's new Public Service Act. Which had not been amended, updated, modernised for decades and had become so kind of labyrinthine and complicated that it wasn't a lot of use really and nobody wanted to touch it. As we thought about putting new modern HR strategies at the centre of our work as an executive team, we realised that talking about professional, non-partisan public service, clarifying the role of political versus political officials versus public servants needed to be clarified, should be clarified. And so, as a public service initiative, we created a team, and it was actually Michel D'Emmanuel who can take the credit for this, who was Associate Secretary of Cabinet at the time, from a number of ministries and central agencies as well, to take a look at what sort of public service act we needed to operate as a modern public service. Did the research, thought about how it connected with our critical human resource goals, about the culture that we wanted to engender as an organisation, about the accountability issues, and just got it done. And here was the thing I like about it was an entirely political public service idea that germinated in public service, was developed by the public service. My job was just to kind of let the Premier know that we were doing it, and it just made sense as the right thing to do, and whistled through and was approved. It was a good piece of work.
The third A we came up with last week was the big A, accountability, and you just mentioned it. You've got a different kind of A team that needs to deal with accountability, making sure that the public service is accountable to the political, making sure that the public service gives the political the tools necessary to make its accountability to the public. Do you perceive an A team for accountability in your shop, in your government? Has there been, how do you perceive that? I mean, A for accountability, A for the A team. Bob?
Even after our half-hour conversation last week, I've struggled with this one a whole lot in terms of what I think this means, in terms of whether I can identify an A team. I can identify all kinds of situations, whether it's through how we're approaching internal audit or various things. But I have to tell you, and again, for any federal government employees in here, I'm really struggling with how the federal government's approaching accountability with the accounting officers and the various different things. And the opposite side of that Tony and I both talked about, which is how do you bring the best out in public servants? And you have to be able to risk, and you have to be able to let people grow. And the two things tend to be a bit counterintuitive. So we're no different than the federal government. We're struggling with that balance too. We live in a world where there's a new generation of auditors generals in the room. Ombudsman, disclosure of wrongdoing, whistleblower, it's a different world. And I quite frankly think that the institution we have, the Westminster model of government, Premier appoints all of the ministers, he also appoints all the deputies, and you're in ministries with legislation that says what the ministry is accountable, and legislation, everything else. But yet to solve the problems of today, that accountability network's got to be, to use an overworked use, horizontal. And we're really struggling trying to figure out how to make that work. And again, that's where I think the deputies table in the provincial government context, or a senior leadership team in municipal government, whatever, I think that's where the real challenge is for us.
Tony, accountability team, is there such a thing?
Well, I mean, accountability in a sense is kind of everybody's responsibility. At the same time, I think that there's a leadership question here. I first of all, I don't think we've got a rules problem in government, to say the least. I think that we've occasionally got compliance problems. When you look at all the things that go wrong in terms of accountability, the so-called accountability issues, they're either about people not taking the rules and processes and expectations seriously and putting them at the centre of our culture, or they're about the fact that somebody actually knew what the rules were but decided just to avoid them. So I'm in the camp that says, if there aren't sufficient rules and processes and protocols, put them in place. Those are the small minority of situations. If we've got a compliance problem, you're not going to fix that by making the rules tougher. You're going to deal with it through better education, surveillance, monitoring, and taking a risk-based approach to compliance. It's part of the modern thinking about inspections and enforcement. I think that we need to be much clearer about what the expectations are for what integrity means in our organisations. I think that we need to, I think this goes to the performance management issues that we know we're all weak on.
Yep.
I think if you let small stuff go, as many of us often do in our busy, just-in-time, hectic lives, as we're operating close to the margins, right? Close to the line a lot of the time to get things done. As managers, as supervisors, as leaders, we'll tend to overlook the small stuff because the job was done. I'm not sure that we can overlook the small stuff. I think, first of all, that small things grow into big things and then become really massive problems and issues for government. The other thing is that as supervisors and managers, kind of makes a bit sense actually, it's easier to deal with the small things, to say the least. It's easier to take people to task for the small things. It's easier to remind people that they're operating in a bit of a grey zone over here and they may want to pull back towards the, if you like, the forces of light. Once those things grow and explode, they're enormously difficult to manage. We all pay a price and we end up with tighter rules. So there are leadership issues, there are cultural issues. This is about expectations, and it's about, I think, making sure that we take care of issues when they're small and before they grow. It's about sort of thinking about where risk is, way down, if you like, well, way upstream, right? And learning to look for the indicators of small problems emerging. Clusters of small problems. I'm getting into Malcolm Sparrow speak now.
Yes.
I'll be accused of being a sparrowheader. I understand is the nomenclature. But those things are top of mind for me, Patrice.
On behalf of everybody, I want to thank you for being candid and for providing us with very interesting insight into the work that you did as Secretaries to Cabinet, your thoughts on leadership and the way it's deployed inside the public service. And on behalf of all of you, I thank you.